A few months ago, I came across a post on Reddit in a subreddit dedicated to toxic family dynamics and the silent survival of scapegoated children. The title stopped my scrolling entirely. It read, AITA for buying my family's estate for $1 and evicting them after they forged my signature 12 years ago. 28,400 upvotes. 3,100 comments. I sat with that post for a whole evening. The glow of my screen was the only light in the room as I read every line, every edit, every desperate response. This story stayed with me for days after. It touched a dark, quiet reality that so few are willing to talk about out loud. What happens when the people who share your blood decide to use money and legal documents to choke the life out of you? It wasn't just about a stolen identity. It was about the systematic dismantling of a person's worth by the very hands that should have protected her. Today, I am going to retell it. I want to unravel it slowly, examining every jagged edge so that anyone surviving a similar storm knows they are not alone in the dark. I've changed names, locations, and many identifying details to protect the privacy of the poster and everyone involved in this story. Some moments have been adapted for the pacing of audio storytelling. In this video, I'll call our protagonist Stella before we step into her world. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, type the word here below. No explanation needed. I read every single one. Now let's listen. My name is Stella Ashford. I am 32 years old. 12 years ago, my mother handed me a forged loan document pointed at the front door and said I was the reason our family was ruined. Today, I sit on the 40th floor of the Apex Land Trust building. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass, the winter morning outside looks crisp, gray, and entirely under my control. Resting perfectly centered on my desk is a massive corporate bailout request. The applicants are desperate, drowning in toxic debt, begging a faceless conglomerate for a lifeline to save their ancestral estate. They have absolutely no idea they are surrendering their legacy to the very daughter they threw out into the snow. The air in the boardroom smelled sterile, a mix of cold ozone from the air purifiers and the distinct chemical scent of freshly printed thermal paper. The soft, rhythmic hiss of the climate control was the only sound permitted in this space. I flipped to the final page of their attached historical financial disclosures. There it was, the ghost from 12 years ago. A photocopy of the original bank loan that destroyed my youth and branded me a thief. But sitting here now with a predator's eye, a cold, sharp realization hit me. I traced the ink of the forged signature with my eyes, then looked at the partially redacted notary seal beside it. Who actually held the stamp that day? I pressed the intercom button, my finger sinking into the cold, brushed aluminum. Sarah. I need the original, unredacted file on this specific notary. Now. We cannot negotiate if we don't know who held the red stamp. Right away. Sarah's voice clipped back. I leaned back into my stiff leather chair. It was designed to keep the spine straight, never allowing you to fully relax. The heavy, metallic clack of my steel fountain pen tapping against the frosted glass desk echoed in the sterile room. If you're watching this and feeling that familiar tightness in your chest when a toxic family member's name pops up on your screen, I need you to know your body's reaction is valid. And the story I'm about to tell, it might be the exact blueprint you need. The bailout request sat on my desk, but the signature at the bottom wasn't mine. It was the trap that nearly destroyed me. 20 minutes later, Sarah stepped into the boardroom. She didn't knock. Efficiency. Didn't waste time on pleasantries here. She slid a thin manila folder across the cold glass of my desk. The sharp edge of the high-grade paper hissed against the surface. The redacted seal. Sarah said, her tone flat. I ran the partial license number through the state registry. We have a match. I opened the folder. The name Elias was printed in bold black ink. He was a private notary and a freelance accountant who had occasionally done the books for my family's estate years ago. But what caught my eye wasn't his name. It was the magnified scan of the seal from that 12-year-old document. There was a microscopic smudge on the outer ring of the red ink. It was a hesitation mark, a stutter in the hand of whoever pressed it down. Elias hadn't just stamped a routine form, he had stamped a lie, and his hand had trembled doing it. I flipped to the financial background check Sarah had compiled. Elias was currently drowning. 3 over-leveraged properties, a failing practice, and creditors circling him like vultures. He was a man who could be bought. He was a man who 12 years ago had already been bought by my mother. Before I could outline my strategy to acquire Elias's debt, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open. It was the intermediary lawyer representing the Ashford family, arriving for our preliminary review. He smelled strongly of cheap cologne and burnt espresso, a sharp, unpleasant contrast to the ozone-filtered air of my sanctuary. He took a seat opposite me, sweating slightly in his suit, entirely unaware of the bloodline connecting me to his clients. "Ms. Ashford," he began, sliding a standard intake form across the table toward me. He offered a cheap blue plastic pen from his breast pocket. "If you could just initial the receipt of the disclosure." I looked at the plastic pen, then looked at him. I didn't reach for it. Instead, I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored jacket and withdrew my own pen, a solid block of machined steel, heavy and cold. I uncapped it and brought it down. Clack. The sound of the metal hitting the glass table made the lawyer jump. I signed my initials with sharp, violent strokes. "My clients are very eager to meet the CEO in person." The lawyer stuttered, hastily retrieving his form. "They are a very close-knit family. They want to appeal to your humanity. They're hoping for a fair arrangement." I stared at him, my face a mask of absolute zero. I hated the word fair. "Tell them the CEO remains anonymous for now." I replied, my voice steady. Just then, the phone on the conference table lit up. It was the front desk. Sarah picked it up, listened for a moment, and then looked at me, her expression tightening. "There is a woman in the lobby," Sarah announced, her eyes locked on mine. "She is claiming to be your mother. She says she doesn't have an appointment, but she brought a homemade pie and is demanding to see the head of the trust." The lawyer blinked in confusion. I didn't blink. I reached over and tapped the button to activate the security monitors on the far wall. The screen flickered to life, showing the high-resolution feed of the ground floor lobby. There she was, Nora Ashford. She was standing on the polished marble floor, wrapped in a beige cashmere coat, holding a pastry box. She was performing her signature role flawlessly, the sweet, slightly confused, deeply devoted matriarch. She was smiling politely at the security guards, tilting her head, playing the harmless victim who just wanted to share some baked goods with a corporate giant. The urge to take the private elevator down to the ground floor spiked in my chest. I wanted to stand in front of her, rip that polite smile off her face, and watch the horror register in her eyes when she realized the faceless conglomerate she was begging from was the daughter she had discarded. The anticipation burned in my throat, but I didn't move. I sat back in my rigid leather chair. I looked at Sarah, who was waiting for my command. "A contract is just a boundary made of paper," I said, my voice echoing in the soundproof room. "And this building is mine." I pressed the intercom button connecting directly to the lobby security desk. "Treat her like an unscheduled vendor, refuse the package, escort her off the premises." On the monitor, I watched the guard step forward. I watched my mother's sweet smile falter, replaced by a flash of indignant rage that she quickly masked with a wounded, trembling lip. She tried to push the pastry box onto the reception counter, but the guard held his hand up. Defeated, she turned and walked out through the revolving glass doors, stepping back out into the freezing winter wind. The guard picked up the pastry box with 2 fingers and dropped it directly into the lobby trash can. If you've ever had a family member try to bypass your clearly stated boundaries by acting like a sweet, confused victim, you know exactly how dangerous that polite smile can be. It's a weapon designed to make you look crazy for defending your own safe space. Nora thought she could charm her way into a boardroom, completely unaware that she had just walked into a trap. Sarah turned my mother away at the lobby, but the voicemail she left triggered a physical reaction I thought I'd buried a decade ago. The physical reaction hit before the elevator doors even closed. The descent to the B4 level of the underground parking garage took exactly 42 seconds, and I spent every one of them trapped inside the voicemail my mother had just left. The audio played through my phone's speaker, echoing slightly in the steel box of the elevator. Nora Ashford's voice was spun sugar and poison. It was light, trembling just enough to suggest a fragile heart, yet perfectly modulated to induce maximum guilt. Stella. Darling. I know there's been a misunderstanding. We just want to talk. We're family. The elevator doors chimed and parted. The air in the sub-basement hit me immediately. A thick, suffocating mix of stale exhaust fumes, spilled motor oil, and the distinct, clammy chill of damp concrete. The blue-white fluorescent lights overhead flickered, emitting a low, erratic buzz that grated against my eardrums. The intrusion at the lobby had been handled with absolute corporate precision. I had won the chess move. But as the voicemail ended, an invisible hand closed tight around my trachea. I walked quickly to my car, the sharp clicks of my heels sounding entirely too hollow in the cavernous space. I slipped into the driver's seat, slammed the heavy door shut, and hit the lock button. The sudden silence inside the cabin was deafening. On the passenger seat rested a thick, vellum-bound contract. It was a standard acquisition file for a mid-size commercial portfolio. But the top page required a personal guarantor signature. My signature. I stared at the dotted line. A cold sweat broke across my palms, making the leather of the steering wheel slick beneath my grip. The pristine white page seemed to blur, the black ink warping into something sinister. My breathing turned shallow, rapid. The carefully constructed armor of the Apex CEO dissolved, leaving behind a terrified 20-year-old girl standing in a freezing hallway. The flashback hit me with physical force. 12 years ago, the bitter draft of a winter storm rattling the poorly insulated windows of the ancestral Ashford home. The smell of cheap bleach trying to mask the scent of decaying wood, and my mother's overpowering, cloying rose potpourri. I had refused to sign away my tiny software startup to cover Chloe's hidden debts. In retaliation, Nora had handed me a stack of loan papers, with my name already perfectly fraudulently signed. "You ungrateful thief!" Nora had screamed, her face twisting into something unrecognizable. "You ruined this family!" In the corner of the living room, slumping against the faded velvet sofa, was Chloe. She was weeping into her hands, the perfect portrait of an innocent bystander ravaged by her older sister's cruelty. As Nora packed my few belongings into a garbage bag, Chloe had looked up at me. Her voice was breathy, dripping with a manufactured helplessness that made my stomach turn. "You know I'd do it myself if I were as strong as you." Stell, Chloe had whimpered. I didn't have time to process the betrayal before the front door was yanked open. The freezing wind howled into the foyer. Nora threw my bag onto the snow-covered porch. Then she reached into her purse, pulled out a tarnished silver dollar, and threw it hard against my chest. It hit my collarbone with a dull smack and fell into the snow. "That's all your value," Nora had spat, slamming the door shut and locking the deadbolt. In the present, inside the freezing underground garage, my lungs gasped for air. I reached blindly across the center console, my manicured fingernails digging into the guarantor document on the passenger seat. I scratched at the paper, dragging my nails across the dotted line until the thick vellum tore with a harsh, grating sound. I pulled my hand back, shaking violently. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. My fingers found the heavy, cold metal of the tarnished silver dollar I had dug out of the snow that night. I pressed its heavy, rigid edge into the pad of my thumb until it bruised, using the physical pain to anchor myself back to the present. The faint, distant squeal of a tire echoed from a ramp somewhere above me, blending with the frantic thudding of my own heartbeat. My hands wouldn't stop shaking in the parking garage. Victor was right, I wasn't a predator yet. I was still just the prey. The Apex boardroom was entirely dark save for the glaring, blue-tinged light of my laptop screen. The city below was a sprawling grid of amber streetlights and crawling traffic, but up here on the 40th floor, the world was silent. The air smelled of cold ozone radiating from the servers running overnight. I sat frozen in my stiff leather chair, my forensic gaze locked on the video playing on my monitor. It was a covert recording from a cafe downtown. Earlier that afternoon, the intermediary lawyer had met with Chloe to discuss the desperate terms of the Ashford family's bailout. Chloe believed she was performing for a representative of a faceless, anonymous billionaire. She had no idea the footage would be sent directly to a secure server straight to the screen of the sister she had erased. On the video, Chloe was a masterpiece of pastel victimhood. She wore an oversized soft pink cardigan that made her look frail, as if the weight of the fabric alone might break her collarbones. Her voice was soft, her words slightly slurred together, accompanied by a practiced, breathy gasp every few sentences. She was playing her autoimmune mystery illness to the hilt, portraying a delicate flower being crushed by the boot of a corporate giant. "We are just a vulnerable family," Chloe whispered on the recording, pressing a pristine white tissue to the corner of her eye. "I can't work. My health just won't allow it. This house is all my mother has left." I watched her face. The lawyer, captivated by her fragility, leaned forward, murmuring reassurances. But I wasn't looking at her tears. I was looking at her eyes. Every time she dabbed at her face, Chloe's gaze flicked away from the lawyer. She was looking past his shoulder, staring directly into the dark, reflective glass of the cafe window. She was checking her own reflection, adjusting her angle to ensure the lighting caught the dampness on her cheeks just right. It was a microscopic adjustment, a habit so ingrained she didn't even know she was doing it. The weeping was a performance. The reflection was the director's monitor. I clicked the mouse, rewinding the footage by 30 seconds. The audio hissed in reverse. I played it again. The lawyer cleared his throat, shuffling his paperwork. "Miss Ashford? Regarding the original mortgage consolidation from 12 years ago, the bank records indicate the paperwork was processed quite swiftly despite the turbulent circumstances." Chloe sniffled, adjusting her cardigan. "Oh," she said, her voice dripping with earnest exhaustion. "I always helped Mom with bank papers because of her arthritis. It was the least I could do when I was feeling up to it." My hand went entirely still over the mouse pad. The cold from the aluminum chassis seeped into my wrist. I always helped Mom with bank papers. The air in the boardroom suddenly felt very thin. I opened a new tab, pulling up the encrypted timeline I had built of the Ashford family's financial history. 12 years ago. On the exact date the forged loan was notarized by Elias, Nora had claimed Chloe was in the middle of a severe medical crisis. I cross-referenced the dates. The pieces of the puzzle clicked together with terrifying clarity. I paused the video. The image of Chloe, frozen mid-sob, stared blindly out from the monitor. I pressed the heels of my hands against my temples, the dull ache of an impending migraine threatening to surface. If you're listening to this and you've ever survived a systemic manipulation, you know that the deepest wounds aren't left by the lies themselves. They are left by the sheer, terrifying audacity of the liar. We like to think that success cures trauma. But if your heart has ever raced at the sight of a specific name on your phone, you understand that the body keeps the score long after the bank account is full. You can build an empire of glass and steel, but one slipped sentence on a covert recording can drag you right back into the freezing dark. I dropped my hands to the desk. The momentary empathy evaporated, replaced by the calculating chill of a predator who had just found the blood trail. Ink from a notary stamp doesn't just smudge on its own. It smudges when the person holding the stamp is nervous. It smudges when they know the person signing the document isn't the person whose name is printed on the line. Nora hadn't just forged my signature. Chloe had been the architect. The hand guiding the pen while Nora stood guard, using her daughter's supposed illness as the ultimate alibi. And Elias had stamped it. He had taken their money, pressed his seal onto the lie, and looked the other way. I reached for my heavy steel fountain pen, turning it over and over in my fingers. The metal was heavy, unforgiving. Elias wasn't just a bystander. He was the keystone holding their entire illusion together. And a man drowning in debt was a man waiting for a lifeline. I found the discrepancy in Elias's old notary logs. The ink proved someone was lying, and I was about to buy his silence. The process of becoming a monster is rarely glamorous. It doesn't happen in a sudden flash of lightning, and it doesn't come with a dramatic soundtrack. It happens in the quiet, miserable hours when your bones are aching from the cold, and you realize that the world only respects leverage. 12 years ago, after the deadbolt clicked shut and left me standing in the snow with a single silver dollar, I didn't miraculously transform into a CEO. I survived the first winter by sneaking into the defunct server room of my bankrupt software startup. The air in that cramped, windowless closet smelled of burning dust and frying ozone. I slept on the hard concrete floor, curled around the humming towers of outdated hardware just to keep from freezing to death. There was no pride in it. It was the absolute indignity of poverty, the kind that hollows out your stomach and teaches you to view every human interaction as a potential transaction. It took 4 years of grinding, starving, and coding in the dark to rebuild a fraction of what was stolen from me. I developed an algorithm designed to predict commercial real estate market failures, a predictive model for corporate death. 8 years ago, at 24, I took that algorithm into the mahogany-paneled office of Victor Thorne. Victor was a brutalist piece of architecture wrapped in a tailored suit. He was a billionaire who had made his fortune by gutting failing hedge funds and selling their organs. I stood before his massive desk desperate. I had just been scammed out of $100,000 by a predatory development partner. I was on the verge of losing the algorithm entirely. I handed Victor my prospectus and begged for an advance on the acquisition. I told him I was a victim. I told him it wasn't fair. Victor didn't blink. He looked at me, his eyes acting as a radar sweeping across a structural flaw. He tossed the prospectus back across the desk. "I bought a wolf, not a begging dog," Victor said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that left absolutely no room for debate. "Handle it yourself or clear your desk tomorrow." He didn't offer a tissue. He didn't offer a loan. He offered me a crucible. I spent the next 48 hours locked in a windowless office drinking burnt espresso until my hands shook, rewriting my own algorithm to target the scammer's over-leveraged assets. I didn't ask for my money back. I used data to trigger a margin call that nearly bankrupted him, forcing him to settle out of court for double the amount. When I placed the settlement check on Victor's desk, he finally nodded. That was the day I stopped hoping for a savior and started building an armory. The milestones over the next 8 years were not measured in emotional healing, but in hard, verifiable numbers. Under Victor's relentless, unsparing mentorship, I learned to weaponize the law. I orchestrated the hostile takeover of 3 major commercial centers before I was 27. I pushed the Apex Land Trust's return on investment to a staggering 18% in a bear market. By the time I turned 29, Victor stepped back into the shadows and the board officially named me Chief Executive Officer. I had climbed from the concrete floor of a server room to the 40th floor of the Apex Tower, but standing in the boardroom now looking at the dossier of the notary, Elias, I felt the dangerous pull of the past trying to drag me backward. I had instructed Sarah to prepare the wire transfer to buy out Elias's debt portfolio. I was going to use my own personal capital. I wanted to own the man who had ruined me. I was typing the authorization code into my terminal when the screen suddenly flashed red. Transaction denied. Account frozen. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom clicked open. Victor Thorne stepped into the sterile LED-lit room. He didn't say a word. He walked to the panoramic window looking out over the gray, winter-choked city. My pulse spiked. The sudden loss of financial control triggered an immediate panic mirroring the helplessness I felt in the parking garage. Victor had frozen my personal funds. He knew exactly what he was doing. "You are making it personal, Stella," Victor said to the glass, his voice devoid of inflection. "Personal money is emotional money. Emotional money leaves a trail. It makes you vulnerable to extortion." I stood up from the leather chair, the stiff material dragging against my suit jacket. My first instinct was to argue, to claim I had it under control. But looking at Victor's broad, immovable back, the lesson crystallized. He wasn't stopping me from destroying them. He was testing my methodology. I was acting like a wounded daughter trying to buy a mercenary. I needed to act like a CEO executing a market correction. I deleted the personal wire transfer. I opened a new terminal window accessing the Apex corporate acquisition channels. I didn't need to bribe Elias with my own money. I drafted a legal order for Apex Land Trust to initiate a hostile, systematic buyout of the parent company that held all 3 of Elias's failing mortgages. It was entirely legal, entirely corporate, and utterly devastating. I hit enter. The request processed. Victor turned away from the window. He looked at the confirmation screen reflecting in my eyes. A slow, terrifying smile touched the corner of his mouth. Without another word, he tapped a command into his tablet and the red banner on my personal accounts vanished. The test was over. I had passed. The high of that victory lasted exactly 3 hours. By mid-afternoon, Sarah walked into the boardroom bypassing the usual protocol. She dropped an iPad onto the glass table. "Chloe is escalating," Sarah said flatly. I looked at the screen. Chloe had uploaded a video to her social media channels. It was a masterclass in digital manipulation. She sat on the floor of the ancestral Ashford home, looking pale and fragile, crying softly into the camera. She spoke breathlessly about a heartless, faceless corporate conglomerate that was trying to evict a sick woman and her elderly mother right before the holidays. She didn't name Apex directly, but the algorithmic breadcrumbs were there. The video already had 400,000 views. I glanced at the secondary monitor on my desk. The Apex stock ticker had suffered a microscopic yet visible dip. My chest tightened, a phantom echo of the rage that used to consume me when Chloe pulled her stunts. She was using her tears to summon an angry mob, turning the internet into her personal shield. I didn't rage. I didn't throw my heavy steel pen across the room. The cold, unfeeling logic of the algorithm Victor had taught me to build settled over my boiling anger like a sheet of thick ice. Algorithms do not have empathy. They respond to density and velocity. I opened the Apex Media Relations terminal. I didn't issue a denial or attack Chloe's character. I simply utilized the firm's immense digital leverage. I authorized the release of a massive, pre-scheduled flood of highly optimized financial press releases regarding our recent eco-friendly urban developments and municipal partnerships. I spent $3 million of marketing budget in 5 minutes buying up every targeted keyword associated with commercial real estate corporate buyouts and the Ashford neighborhood. Within an hour, the sheer volume and velocity of Apex's corporate data drowned Chloe's video. It was pushed off the trending pages, buried under an avalanche of dense, boring financial news. Her manufactured outrage was starved of the oxygen it needed to go viral. I watched her view count, stagnate, and flatline. The threat was neutralized not with emotion, but with systemic weight. With the digital noise silenced, I turned my attention back to the kill shot. I pulled up the medical records Sarah had quietly extracted during the background check on Elias's mortgages. I scrolled to the date 12 years ago, the day the forged loan was notarized. According to Nora's desperate defense that night, Chloe had been suffering a severe autoimmune flare-up and had been rushed to the emergency room, leaving her utterly incapacitated and incapable of understanding what I had supposedly stolen. I stared at the medical ledger. The entry for that date was entirely, undeniably blank. There was no emergency room visit. There was no admission. There wasn't even a prescription refill. Chloe had been perfectly fine, likely sitting at the dining room table steadying her hand to trace the letters of my name onto a bank document. I picked up the heavy machined steel fountain pen from the desk. I gripped it tightly, the cold metal grounding me, and brought it down against the glass surface with a sharp, decisive clack. The snare was set. Elias's corporate overlords were now owned by Apex. His professional life belonged to me. The mystery of the signature was solved. Chloe's tears on camera rallied the internet against Apex, but she forgot one crucial detail: algorithms don't dictate commercial real estate law. The cold adrenaline of algorithmic victory rarely lasts until dawn. By 4 a.m., sleep was impossible. The transition from night to morning in the underground parking garage was entirely conceptual. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with the same erratic, blue-white intensity they had 12 hours prior. I sat in the driver's seat of my car, the engine off, the air inside the cabin growing steadily colder. Resting on my lap was an envelope. It was pale pink, thick stock, and addressed to me in a sweeping, elegant cursive that made my stomach churn. It had bypassed the Apex corporate firewalls entirely by arriving via physical courier, slipped into the incoming executive mail pile. It was a handwritten letter from my mother. I stared at the looping letters of my name. Even now, holding the physical proof of her intrusion, I felt a treacherous, pathetic knot forming in my throat. I broke the seal. The scent hit me instantly. It wasn't the sterile ozone of my boardroom or the stale exhaust of the garage. It was the overpowering, cloying scent of cheap rose potpourri, the exact smell of the foyer on the night she threw me out. The smell of manufactured warmth. I unfolded the paper. The edges were sharp against my fingertips. Stella, my darling girl. The letter began. The words seemed to vibrate on the page, saturated with Nora's saccharine poison. I know you are out there somewhere. I know you are hurting. But I also know that blood is thicker than any misunderstanding. We are your family. I pray for you every day. No matter what mistakes you made when you were young, my arms are always open to welcome you home. My breath hitched. The carefully constructed ice of the Apex CEO fractured. For 3 seconds, I wasn't the predator who had just orchestrated a multi-million-dollar hostile takeover. I was the desperate 20-year-old girl standing in the snow, longing for the mother who had locked the deadbolt. The physical reaction was immediate. A wave of nausea, a tightening in my chest. A desperate urge to believe the lie. I reached blindly into the inner pocket of my suit jacket. My fingers closed around the tarnished cold metal of the silver dollar. I pressed its heavy, rigid edge against my palm, using the sting of the metal to ground myself in the present. That's all your value. I forced my eyes back to the letter, reading past the emotional manipulation, reading it like a contract. I scanned the paragraphs looking for the liability. Then I found it. Tucked into a paragraph about how hard the last decade had been, Nora had written, "Ever since you left, your sister and I have had to struggle so much. We've had to scramble to pay off that massive, high-interest loan just to keep a roof over our heads." The fog in my mind vanished, instantly replaced by a razor-sharp clarity. We've had to scramble to pay off that massive loan. If I had truly been the one who forged the signature, if I had been the thief who stole the money and ran, why would Nora and Chloe be the ones making the monthly payments to the creditors? They wouldn't. They would have reported the fraud to the police. They would have cleared the debt. They were paying it because they had spent it. Nora wasn't offering forgiveness. She was desperately trying to reel her scapegoat back in before the house was foreclosed on. The heavy, suffocating weight of emotional abuse lifted, leaving behind a cold, pure vacuum. I didn't feel sadness. I didn't feel rage. I felt forensic. I opened the car door and stepped out into the freezing garage. The echo of my heels against the damp concrete sounded different now, not hollow, but purposeful. I walked straight to the private elevator, clutching the pink letter. When the doors opened on the 40th floor, I walked directly to the heavy-duty industrial shredder humming in the corner of the boardroom. I didn't hesitate. I fed the thick, rose-scented paper into the steel teeth. The machine chewed it up with a violent, satisfying screech, turning my mother's emotional blackmail into confetti. People will call you cold. They'll say you changed. But if you've ever had to sever a toxic tie to survive, you know that sometimes being the villain in their story is the only way to be the hero in your own. The truth is, love doesn't require a guarantor signature. And forgiveness doesn't mean offering your throat to the knife a second time. I pressed the intercom on my desk. Sarah, locate Elias. I'm ready to squeeze. Victor gave me an ultimatum: cut the emotional deadweight or lose the company. I had exactly 24 hours to choose my poison. Victor's private cigar club was a sanctuary of absolute, uncompromising power. It was hidden behind an unmarked mahogany door in the financial district, insulated from the noise of the city by layers of thick wool carpet and heavy velvet drapes. The air inside was warm, heavy, and saturated with the rich, peppery smell of expensive Cohiba cigars and aged bourbon. I sat in a deep, tufted leather armchair in a secluded corner booth. The rough texture of the tweed upholstery caught against the fabric of my suit. Across the room, half hidden in the shadows, Victor sat silently, a glass of amber liquid resting on the arm of his chair. He was watching me. The final crucible. At exactly 7 p.m., the heavy brass door of the club opened. Elias walked in. Or rather, he stumbled in. The private security contractors I had hired to escort him had done their job without leaving a single bruise. Elias was sweating profusely. His cheap suit wrinkled, his eyes darting frantically around the dimly lit room. He looked like a cornered rat who had just realized the maze had no exit. He saw me and practically collapsed into the chair across the table. "Ms. Ashford." Elias gasped, his voice trembling. I don't understand. Your firm bought out my parent company this morning. My accounts are frozen. My licenses are suspended. They said I had to come here." The satisfying clink of ice against crystal echoed from Victor's corner. I looked at Elias, the man who had stamped my death warrant 12 years ago for a few $1,000s in bribe money. The audience inside my head, the terrified 20-year-old girl, screamed at me to flip the table, to grab him by the collar and demand a confession. I didn't move a muscle. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the uneven, natural grain of the wooden table. I slid a single sheet of paper across the dark wood. It was a summary of his insurmountable debt, now wholly owned by Apex Land Trust. "I'm not here to collect your money, Elias," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly flat. "You don't have any. I am here to collect 12 hours of your time." He stared at the paper, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. "12 years ago, you notarized a consolidation loan for Nora Ashford. The signature was a forgery," I stated, presenting the fact not as an accusation but as a solved equation. "I know you didn't do it for free, but I also know you are a meticulous, paranoid accountant. You wouldn't have processed a fraudulent document without keeping the carbon copy original as an insurance policy. A physical document with actual fingerprints." Elias paled. The ambient warmth of the cigar club seemed to suddenly drop by 10 degrees. "I don't need a confession." I continued, my gaze pinning him to the chair. "I need that document. You have exactly 12 hours to retrieve the original unredacted file. If it is not on my desk by 7 a.m., I will liquidate your firm, report your malpractice to the state board, and ensure you spend the rest of your life sleeping under a bridge." Elias swallowed hard. He looked around the room, seeking a witness, a savior, anyone. He found only the impassive shadow of Victor Thorne. I'll get it," Elias stammered, standing up so quickly his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "I have it in a safety deposit box. I'll get it tonight." He practically ran out of the club. I picked up my glass of sparkling water, the condensation cool against my palm. I took a slow sip. Victor stepped out of the shadows and approached my booth. The smell of his cigar smoke was dense and commanding. He looked down at me, his expression unreadable. "You didn't ask for an apology." Victor noted, his gravelly voice cutting through the soft jazz playing in the background. "Are you going to let them walk away with a settlement?" I looked up at him. The last remnants of the girl who sought her family's approval had been shredded along with Nora's letter. I met my mentor's eyes with a gaze that reflected his own chilling pragmatism. "I'm not settling, I'm foreclosing." Victor held my gaze for a long moment. Then a dark, Approving smirk touched the corner of his mouth. He leaned in closer. "The stupidest enemy," he murmured, "is the one who leaves their fingerprints on the carbon copy." My phone buzzed on the table. It was Sarah. "Stella." Sarah's voice was crisp. "The Ashford lawyers are panicking. They're requesting a last-minute revision to the preliminary transfer terms. They want to secure a residency clause for the mother." "Deny the revision," I ordered immediately. "Tell them they sign the preliminary agreement exactly as it stands in the boardroom tomorrow morning, or the anonymous buyer pulls the capital and the bank seizes the house by noon." "Understood," Sarah replied. The countdown had begun. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and the steel teeth were ready to snap shut. Elias slid the original document across the mahogany table. The fingerprints on page 4 belonged to the one person supposedly too sick to stand. The morning of the execution was blindingly bright. The winter sun reflected off the frost-covered skyscrapers, flooding the Apex boardroom with a pure, white light that offered absolutely nowhere to hide. The temperature in the room was kept precisely at 68 degrees, crisp enough to keep everyone alert, cold enough to make the desperate feel exposed. At 7 a.m., the heavy oak doors opened. Elias walked in. He looked as though he hadn't slept in a week. His hands were shaking violently as he unclasped a battered leather briefcase and withdrew a clear plastic sleeve. "Here," he rasped, sliding it across the black glass table. I didn't touch it immediately. I let it sit there. It was the original carbon copy master file of the loan document from 12 years ago. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the faded ink. The signature on the dotted line was a clumsy, wavering imitation of my name. But the real prize wasn't the ink. Right below the signature line, pressed firmly into the bottom corner of the page, was a distinct oily smudge. It was a partial thumbprint, left behind by someone pressing down hard to keep the thick paper steady while forcing a forged signature. "My private investigator ran the prints against the state database last night using the digital scan you sent," Sarah said, stepping out of the shadows near the door. She handed me a tablet. I looked at the screen. The biometric match was a 99% certainty. The thumbprint didn't belong to my mother. It belonged to Chloe, the girl who was supposedly languishing in an emergency room, too fragile to walk, too sick to speak, had possessed the steady, calculating grip required to hold a forged document in place while stealing my identity. Nora hadn't just covered for her. Nora had stood in that living room and watched her golden child sign my life away. The central mystery that had haunted me for a decade evaporated in the cold light of the boardroom. "Your debt is cleared, Elias," I said, not looking up from the tablet. "Get out of my building." He didn't need to be told twice. As the door clicked shut behind him, Sarah handed me another tablet. "Chloe posted again," Sarah reported dryly. I tapped the screen. Chloe was escalating her digital tantrum. She was live streaming from her pristine, pastel-colored bedroom, weeping hysterically about how the evil corporation was ignoring her pleas, rallying her followers to crash the Apex server with negative reviews. I felt nothing but a profound clinical disgust. I opened the Apex Media dashboard. With 3 keystrokes, I authorized the deployment of a targeted algorithmic countermeasure. Apex didn't attack Chloe. We simply optimized the search engine visibility for every major commercial real estate success story in the continent, burying her hashtag under an impenetrable wall of corporate data. I watched the live analytics as her videos reach flatlined. Her digital weapon was dismantled before she even finished her broadcast. "They're here," Sarah said softly, glancing at her earpiece. "Put them in the main boardroom. I'll take the secondary monitor room," I replied. The secondary monitor room was a narrow, pitch-black space situated directly behind the main boardroom. The wall dividing them wasn't solid. It was a floor-to-ceiling two-way mirror. From the inside, the Ashford family saw only a sleek, black, reflective surface. From my side, I had a godlike view of the entire room. The heavy doors opened. Nora and Chloe walked in, flanked by their sweating, cheap-cologned lawyer. The physical proximity sent a jolt of static through my nervous system. I stepped up to the glass close enough that the cold seeped through my suit jacket. They were less than 3 feet away. I could see the fresh blowout in Chloe's hair. I could see the expensive, desperately maintained tailoring of Nora's coat. The Apex legal team entered the room, taking their seats opposite the Ashford family. The senior partner placed a thick stack of papers on the table, the preliminary transfer agreement. The CEO is reviewing the final clauses, the Apex lawyer stated professionally. Before the final signature, we require your signatures on the preliminary asset transfer. Chloe immediately launched into her routine. She slumped slightly in her chair, placing a trembling hand over her chest. She looked at the Apex lawyers with wide, tear-filled eyes. Please. Chloe gasped, her voice echoing through the hidden speakers into my dark room. We are just a vulnerable family. My health. The stress of this is literally killing me. Is there any way the CEO would consider letting us keep the guest house? I stared through the glass. Chloe was weeping perfectly, her chest heaving. But as she dabbed her eyes, her gaze darted away from the lawyers. She looked directly at the black glass wall hiding me. She was checking her own reflection. She adjusted her posture, making sure she looked suitably tragic. The revulsion I felt was absolute. As I watched her manipulate the lawyers with the exact same breathy cadence she used 12 years ago, the phantom echo of her voice rang in my ears. You know I'd do it myself if I were as strong as you. Sign the preliminary documents or the offer is rescinded immediately. The Apex lawyer replied, immune to the performance. Nora panicked. She grabbed the pen and hastily scribbled her name, then shoved the paper toward Chloe. Chloe, realizing the tears weren't working, dropped the fragile act instantly. Her hand didn't shake as she gripped the pen and signed away her rights. They looked relieved. They smiled at each other, whispering excitedly. They believed they had won. They believed the anonymous billionaire had bought their sob story and bailed them out. The trap had snapped shut. They were completely legally bound. I stepped back from the cold glass. The darkness of the monitor room felt like a cocoon of pure potential energy. I straightened my suit jacket. I checked the heavy steel fountain pen in my pocket. I pulled the tarnished silver dollar out and gripped it tightly in my left hand. I walked out of the monitor room and approached the heavy oak doors of the main boardroom. They signed the preliminary agreement entirely unaware that the anonymous billionaire they were praising was the daughter they threw away. It was time. I stood before the heavy oak doors of the Apex boardroom for one final heartbeat. Then I pushed. They swung open without a sound, the hinges perfectly oiled. The sterile, white LED light of the room spilled out into the hallway, illuminating the flawless cut of my tailored suit. I stepped over the threshold. Inside, the Ashford family was mid-celebration. Nora was whispering excitedly to the intermediary lawyer, a look of desperate relief washing over her face. Chloe was leaning back in her chair, a soft, victorious smile playing on her lips. They were waiting for the anonymous billionaire. They were waiting for their savior. They got me. Nora looked up first, her mouth open to form a polite greeting, but the words died in her throat. The expensive leather handbag resting on her lap slipped from her grasp and hit the floor with a dull thud. Chloe turned her head a second later. The triumphant smile vanished, replaced instantly by an expression of sheer, unadulterated shock. The color drained from her face so completely she looked like a wax figure left out in the cold. I didn't say a word. I didn't smile. I didn't offer a dramatic villain monologue. I simply walked across the room. The only sound was the deliberate, rhythmic click of my heels against the polished floor. The silence stretched out thick and suffocating. It lasted for a full 2 minutes, 120 seconds of agonizing, breathless tension, where the only thing they could do was look at the monster they had created. The air in the room, usually just crisp, suddenly felt heavy with the cold sweat of their fear. I reached the head of the immense black glass table. I pulled out the CEO's chair and sat down. The intermediary lawyer, thoroughly confused by the sudden drop in temperature, cleared his throat. Ah, Ms. Ashford, I wasn't expecting. He looked between me and Nora. I apologize. I didn't realize you were related. Nora's breathing became erratic. She gripped the edge of the table. Stella. She choked out her voice, barely a whisper. Chloe, realizing the trap she was in, panicked. She defaulted to the only weapon she knew. She slumped forward, clutching her chest, and began to hyperventilate. Her eyes darted wildly, trying to find a reflective surface in the glare of the LEDs. She let out a sharp, theatrical gasp. My heart. I can't. I can't breathe. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cold glass. The icy temperature of the table leached the warmth from my skin, but I welcomed it. Stop checking your reflection in the glass, Chloe, I said. My voice was a flat, chilling monotone that echoed in the soundproof room. There are no cameras here, and my bank account doesn't have a nervous system. Chloe froze. The gasping stopped instantly. The illusion shattered in front of the room full of lawyers. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was the total annihilation of her entire personality. Nora finally found her voice, though it cracked pathetically. Stella, why we were just trying to survive. We made mistakes, yes, but you stole from us. We had to pay off that loan. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I reached into my dossier and pulled out the original carbon copy loan document Elias had surrendered. I tossed it across the slick, black glass. It slid smoothly, stopping exactly in front of Nora. Page 4, bottom right corner, I instructed calmly. Nora looked down. She saw the clumsy forgery of my signature, and then she saw the dark, oily smudge of a thumbprint pressed into the paper. 99% biometric match to your youngest daughter, I stated, watching the final pillars of Nora's denial crumble. You didn't pay off a loan I stole. You paid off the money Chloe stole using my name while you stood there and let her do it. You threw me out into the snow to protect a thief. Nora stared at the thumbprint. Her jaw trembled. Stella, please. You don't understand. I understand leverage, I interrupted smoothly. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out my heavy machined steel fountain pen. The metal was frigid. I slid it across the table until it rested against Chloe's trembling hand. The preliminary agreement you just signed waived your right to contest the final transfer. I explained the words, clipping the air like a metronome. Now, you will sign the final deed of transfer for the estate. You are selling it to Apex Land Trust. Chloe looked at the steel pen as if it were a venomous snake. For how much? She whispered. I reached into my left pocket. My fingers closed around the tarnished cold metal of the silver dollar. I pulled it out and slammed it down onto the glass table. Clack. Price of transfer? I said, my voice devoid of any human warmth. $1. That's all your value. Nora let out a strangled sob. The lawyer sitting next to them wiped sweat from his forehead. He leaned in and whispered frantically to Nora, confirming the horrific truth. The paperwork they had eagerly signed minutes ago made this entirely brutally legal. They had handed me the keys to their destruction. We wait years for them to say, I'm sorry. But what happens when you realize you don't need their apology anymore because you hold the keys to the building? You don't need their guilt when you have their deed. I looked at Chloe. She was shaking so hard she couldn't pick up the pen. Her pastel cardigan looked ridiculous in the harsh light of the boardroom. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted. It had been eradicated. I stood up, walked slowly around the enormous table, and leaned down right next to Chloe's ear. The smell of her terror was palpable. You know I'd do it myself if I were as strong as you, I whispered. Chloe flinched as if I had struck her. A ragged sob tore from her throat. Her trembling fingers finally closed around the heavy steel pen. With jerky, erratic movements, she signed her name on the final line. Nora wept silently beside her, her mascara running completely ruined. Chloe's tears stopped instantly as she stared at the silver dollar. For the first time in 12 years, my mother had absolutely nothing to say. The execution was over. The paperwork was collected by the Apex legal team, who filed out of the room with quiet, stunned efficiency. Sarah remained by the door, a silent sentinel. Nora and Chloe stood up. They looked shrunken, stripped of the unearned arrogance that had sustained them for over a decade. They began the long, agonizing walk toward the heavy oak doors. Just before crossing the threshold, Nora stopped. She turned back to face me. The mask of the polite victim was gone, replaced by the raw, ugly desperation of a cornered animal. "You can't do this." Nora screamed, her voice cracking, echoing harshly in the large, empty room. "I am your mother." I stood at the head of the table. The late afternoon sun had finally broken through the winter clouds outside, casting a warm golden light across the sterile glass and steel of the boardroom. The storm that had raged inside my chest for 12 years was finally completely quiet. I looked at the woman who had birthed me, and I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sorrow. Just the clean, pure air of a slate wiped clean. "A contract is just a boundary made of paper," I said calmly. Sarah opened the door wider, gesturing for them to leave. Nora stared at me for one last breathless second before turning away. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind them. The silence that filled the room wasn't the suffocating quiet of a hostage situation. It was the deep, resonant stillness of a reclaimed territory. They were wrong because they loved their own comfort and their constructed image more than they loved the truth. But for years I had been wrong too. I had been wrong to wait for their tears. I had been wrong to think that my healing required their confession. I realized then that I didn't need them to admit they had broken me. I only needed to prove to myself that I had rebuilt the pieces into something unbreakable. I didn't forgive them because they deserved it. I forgave them by forgetting they existed. They were no longer a liability on my ledger. They were simply written off. We are told from a young age that family is everything. We are told that blood is a bond that cannot be broken, a debt that must always be paid. But when the people who are supposed to protect you become the architects of your destruction, you have to rewrite the rules of engagement. Forgiveness does not mean leaving the front door unlocked for the thief to return. The greatest revenge isn't forcing your abusers to admit they were wrong. It is reaching a point where your existence, your success, and your peace of mind no longer revolve around proving anything to them at all. Financial independence isn't just about wealth. It is the ultimate boundary. When the boundaries of love and blood fail, you must build boundaries of paper, backed by the unforgiving weight of the law. You protect yourself with contracts, with distance, and with the absolute refusal to play their games. You stop being the prey the moment you refuse to bleed for their comfort. Before we go, tell me in the comments, what is one boundary you've set this year that you are most proud of, big or small? Tell me about the moment you chose your own peace over someone else's comfort. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing. There are more stories to share and more boundaries to build. Until next time, stay safe and protect your peace.